Good evening, wonderful citizens of Zimbabwe, wherever you are. Tonight, we are going to be talking about various issues trending as we get to the 2018 election. But before we begin in earnest, we'd like to make sure that you are hearing me loud and clear. So if you could signal if you are hearing me, if the sound is actually coming out loud and clear. Yeah, it looks like everyone is hearing. All right. So let me start again. Good evening, wonderful people of Zimbabwe. As you know, we are at a very historic moment in the history of our nation. And we're getting closer and closer to a very, very important election in 2018. And we thought it would be good for us to engage on this platform and for me to share some of my ideas. I have about 7 things that I want to go through today. And as I'm going through these things, I'll also be responding to some of your questions. But let me start, first of all, by just going through some of the points that I wanted to discuss with you. Again, as I said, this is an incredibly important moment in the history of our nation. And I've said in other platforms that in some ways, the consequences of what is going to happen in 2018 are much more important than 1980, really. Because for the first time in the history of our country, we want to accomplish the convergence of independence and freedom. We want to accomplish the convergence of those two things. And in order for us to build a great nation, those two things have to converge. As you remember, in the euphoria of independence in 1980, there are kind of some things that we overlooked. We were very happy that we were getting our independence from colonial rule. And, we gave our leaders as much room to do what they wanted as we felt they should. And we actually felt that because they were our leaders, they were coming from the liberation movement and so on, they would automatically do the right thing. So some of the things that we were supposed to actually make sure did not happen in this country by having adequate checks and balances, we didn't do it. And it came back to bite us. And 37 years after independence, we now understand that there is a difference between independence and freedom. I would like to say that we must always remember that those who went out to the war, and that includes my uncle who went to the war in 1963, well ahead of the time when it became trendy for people to cross and go to Mozambique or go to Zambia through Botswana. In fact, well ahead of the time that even President Mugabe went to join the war, which he only did in 1974. Those people who started this thing were fighting for freedom. That is what they were fighting for. They were fighting for freedom. And to them, that's why they were called freedom fighters. They were not called independence fighters. They were called freedom fighters. But you and I know that that did not happen in 1980, from 1980 to 2017. We had a truncated kind of freedom, although we rightfully, obviously, celebrated our independence every 18th of April. So one of the important things is that we need to really start correcting the historic narrative, because all this time what has happened is that ZANU-PF has owned the narrative. They have said to us who our heroes are, and in fact they have determined who we even celebrate as our heroes, who is buried at Heroes Acre, for instance, and who is not worthy to be buried at Heroes Acre. And it became a narrower and narrower description of a hero, and that hero had to be a ZANU-PF person who is committed to the policies of Robert Mugabe, instead of actually that hero being a freedom fighter, a true freedom fighter in every sense of the word. So we're going to have to do quite a bit of work to correct the historic narrative. That's really critical. Future generations need to know the right history of this country, who were the true freedom fighters. And as time has passed, we can now see that some of the people who we call freedom fighters actually were fighting for their own personal wealth. They were fighting for their right to rule eternally. They were not fighting to build the nation. And I'm reminded even of some of the people who have dismissed in history, sometimes as traitors. And that was one of the favorite words that was used even during the liberation struggle, to demean someone, to sideline someone, to make sure that you could go above that person. You simply found a way to label them a traitor. And that happened over to so many people. There are a lot of people that we have forgotten. I was having a chat today with some people, reminding them of people like Enoch Tumbujena. I don't think that there are many Zimbabweans, and certainly not the young ones, who even remember that there were men like that, who were the ones who were defending as lawyers the freedom fighters who were being harassed by the colonial government. And in fact, in the case of Enoch Tumbujena himself, at independence, then became the first black Chief Justice of Zimbabwe. And after serving in that capacity very, very well, acquitting himself well, and really being recognized as an international jurist who had a fair reputation and a solid understanding of the law, once he left government, because of the things that he understood, the things that he knew, the things that he saw from his vantage point, and started saying to the Zimbabwean people, we are going in the wrong direction here, and we really need to do something about it. And as a result, was maligned. And in fact, today, if you ask most Zimbabweans who Enoch Tumbujena is, they won't even know or even know where he is buried. It is very, very important for us to correct the historic narrative, and in the process, begin to rediscover our heroes. We must rediscover our true heroes. And here I'm not necessarily advocating a backward-looking approach where we are then just immobilized and everything just becomes about rediscovering who our heroes are. But it's very, very important to revisit what these people were saying, because those are the things that were supposed to be foundational for our state. Instead, what we ended up with, people coming out of the liberation struggle, leading our country, who were so anxious to please those people who may have supported them during the liberation struggle, but really for their own selfish purposes as well. So we must rediscover our heroes. It's important. It's important for the future of our country to do so. The second thing that must happen is that we must mint new heroes. We must mint new heroes. In other words, we must give Zimbabweans, every Zimbabwean, the opportunity to excel as nation builders, to bring their ideas forth. In the process of doing that, we must also be careful not to just think that new heroes it can happen without them being informed about matters of past history. So these two sides need to marry, the rediscovering of our heroes and the minting of our new heroes. These things need to come together so that we can have informed new leaders who understand the history of our country. You can't throw away the history of our country. You can't be dismissive of some of the pain, for instance, that people went through as a result of colonialism. It's important to remember that, yes, indeed, there was a Land Apportionment Act. There was indeed a Land Tenure Act that dispossessed people of their land. And it's important to really tell that story right. And when I say tell that story right, it's also important for us to tell that story right, even remembering that there are people who have a entrenched interest in dismissing even the ability of Africans to farm. The tragedy of this country was also because they were dispossessed. The reason why they did not produce as much as the commercial farmers is because they were put on sandy soils, they were put on the least arable land and so on, and that's a fact. So as we meet new heroes, as we rediscover our old heroes, it's important that we tell the story of Zimbabwe in the right way. It's really, really important, because that will also inform how we create a social contract based on truth. That's the only kind of social contract that can carry us forward. So yeah, correcting the historic narrative, rediscovering our heroes, minting new heroes, and some of those new heroes include some of the young people that we have seen lately who are actually saying, I'm going to run for election. I'm going to run as a councillor. I'm going to run as an MP. I'm going to do those things that have traditionally been the preserve of ZANU-PF. I'm going to do things even that normally you couldn't do without a party structure. Because unfortunately, in our country, we have assumed that the only leaders who should actually serve in public office are those that come through some kind of political party structure, and that, some of these political party structures are the best ones to actually vet and select the right kind of leadership. That couldn't be further from the truth. We have had dysfunctional government, central government. We have had dysfunctional local governments. And most of those leaders have come through the culture and structures of political parties which are there. So I am very, very excited, actually, to see some young people saying, you know what, I am going to run, whether I'm going to do that on a platform which has been newly established, or I'm going to do that as an independent. That is wonderful, wonderful news for the nation of Zimbabwe. So we must allow those new heroes to be minted. And in fact, what is interesting about it is that we look at these people who are running and we say they're young people, and we say they're youths. That is because in our country, there's something that has happened which is really tragic. A person who is 35 years old is called a youth. A person who is 40 is called a youth. I was engaging with some young people the other day, and I said, look, by the time I was 26, I was married. And by the time I was 33, I had 2 children. And so I was a family man. And that was the peak of my productive potential. And what I needed at that time was not a youth program. And we'll get into that in a little bit. What I needed was a job. What I needed was the full freedom to be able to start a company, to be able to create enterprises, and so on. That's what even the young people of Zimbabwe need today. But, I'm going ahead of myself. We will talk about that in a minute. Let me go back to this whole idea of independence and freedom, because I think this is absolutely critical for us to really understand. So yeah, we started fighting against colonial rule, and people left the country because of the hardships that people were experiencing. The hardships were because of lack of freedom. You can take that statement, lack of freedom, and subsume everything. So lack of independence is just a part of it, because we know that you can have independence and you can have your own people in a non-colonial setting actually oppressing their own kind. And it's really, really important for us to understand that, to really be able to differentiate the two in our politics. So you can have a situation where you no longer have colonial rule, but you have your own people running government, and those people actually denying their own full freedom. And then you can have some things which look like freedom. I want to address, for instance, some of the things that the ruling party has done over the years, the creation of the Women's League. And you would think that is really giving women the freedom that they deserve. Giving the women the platform to actually say certain things loudly, to castigate the opposition, giving women the platform to say certain things loudly, to castigate the next generation, which yearns for something different. Setting up women against their own children. And in the meantime, after they go to the airport to meet the traveling president and Vachitamba Kongonya and all of that, they go back to the same situations in their home where there is no running water, where there is no electricity, where their children do not have jobs, where they really can't make ends meet. So there are some things which look like freedom. They look like we are affirming women, when in fact it really isn't. So we got our independence, and we got these pretend programs that claim to actually be showing, empowering women so that they're truly free, when in fact they're not. And then go to the youth with the very same things. Since independence, we have had various youth programs created by ZANU-PF for their own reasons. And lately, just before the happenings in November, we know that ZANU-PF went around and there were all these youth interface rallies, which were supposed to be a time for exchanging ideas with the youth and empowering the youth and showing that the youth are really free and they're going to benefit primarily from indigenization and all of that. And many of these things were just promises. And many of the young people were sold this bad bill of goods, and they were convinced that as a result they were free. And yet, if you looked objectively at the situation of the youth in this country, in fact, when we say 90% unemployment, when we say Zimbabwe's informal sector is the 6th largest in Africa, the people who are really impacted are the youths. When we say, some of these young people who have gone through our colleges and universities have not had jobs in the past 10 years, the people who are primarily affected are the youths. And none of the things that have been created by ZANU-PF, which they claim to actually give youth freedom to excel, none of those things have done so. So independence is not the same as freedom. And in 2018, when we vote in 2018, what we are voting for is a government that will actually make sure that we have both independence and freedom. Let's look at the diaspora, for instance. Right now, and this is another point that I'm going to get to a little later and really talk about it. When you have as many of your people outside the country, having fled, some of them, the economic hardships in the country, when you have people who have been forced out, and these are your citizens, and they're the same ones who for the past 10, 15 years have been really keeping even this economy going. And sometimes people wonder and say, why is it that Zimbabwe hasn't completely fallen apart? It's because there is a group of people that has actually been keeping this economy going with their remittances of $1 billion each year of remittances coming into Zimbabwe because of the diaspora. And the gratitude they get from this government. In the process, obviously, they did not do that to prop up the government. They did that to support their families. But, as a result, the government, which was, had a false sense of comfort and actually congratulated itself that, they're keeping things going, when in fact it's the citizens of this country. It's the people in the diaspora, it's the hardworking citizens on the ground which have actually kept this country going. Now, why should that constituency, huge constituency, who have done so much for this country, why should that constituency not be allowed to vote? Why is it that that constituency is denied the ability to determine the direction of this country and to fully participate in building it? And those are some of the things that we have to be very, very careful of. And while I'm at this point, and I'm sorry I'm going to take some time talking about independence and freedom, I've got to call out some people, some sections of our society who are so eager for us to settle for something which is less than our full freedom. And there are many of them. And some of these people include people who are in the business community. Some of these people are so anxious for things to stabilize. They're not anxious for us to have our full freedom. No. They're anxious for things to stabilize so that they can, go back to doing business. They can get the contracts that they want. And some of them are very, very eager to impress the people who are now in power, and say to those people, we in the business community support the new dispensation. The question that we must ask is that our interests, the interests of the ordinary Zimbabwean, the interest of the person who is in Checheche, the interest of the person who is in Lupani, are those interests aligned with the interest of the business person who every day is trying to convince us that, it's done now, and everybody must just be happy with what is right now, and we must vote for this very same people who were part of a government that denied us our freedom for such a long time. And, I'm sorry to say, we have a lot of people in the business community whose interests are not aligned with the ordinary person in Zimbabwe. And if we are not careful, these people who are business people will then make us settle for less than our freedom for their own purposes. And it's really, really important that we call them out. Another group of people that we must call out is the members of the international community who want this thing to be quickly over so that they can go back they can actually now compete again for space with the Chinese. I said to some friends recently, I don't blame, when we look at members of the international community, none of them are going to be our saviors. The only people who can actually bring about the change that we need are Zimbabweans. Everybody else who is a non-Zimbabwean will work in their own self-interest. Now, you know what? And we have got to get that through to our hearts and our heads. And that has to determine how we actually interact with the international community. We know that there are countries who also want what the Chinese have in this country. And what the Chinese have had in this country through ZANU-PF has been an advantage over others. And when they come in, and never think that any of the so-called friends that we have will simply do things that will benefit us, unless we ourselves have a very, very strong sense of what we have. And we leverage that in our negotiations with everybody, Chinese, American, British, French. It really doesn't matter who they are. We as Zimbabweans must also understand that we have something that they want. And the reason why we must give our government a huge mandate as a people is so that a government can go into interactions with other nations with that confidence. We know they want something from us. They do want our resources. And it's our responsibility as Zimbabweans to make sure that any deals that we sign benefit us as a people. I get very concerned actually when this government, which is really an interim kind of government, which is serving out the balance of Robert Mugabe's term, I get very concerned when they announce these big deals. These are not deals that are actually processed in a transparent way. These are deals that we are going to be settled with as a people after the 2018 elections. And we're going to have to honor the terms of some of those deals which we don't know. I mean, we don't know how they arrived at those deals. And it's really, really critical going forward that we understand that as long as we are not really, really conscious of some of these things, we're going to have less of our freedom, all of our independence, less of our freedom, because of not understanding how these things work. So independence and freedom, that is the responsibility that we have in 2018 to make sure that there is a true convergence of those two. Now, let me go on to the next subject, and I'll leave the questions to the end, and I will respond to the questions that are being posed. And so let's now go to the youths. Someone recently asked me, I was on a flight with a young man, and he said, you know what, I love what you say, but I'm a young man, and I really need to hear from you what you have for me as a young person. And I knew exactly where this question was going, and what I was expected to say in response. Because when it comes to election time, what you're going to find is that politicians are going to give you a list of the things that they promise. And a lot of people are going to make decisions on who they vote for, depending on the length of the list that they are given, that relates to their particular demographic group. So I'm sure the expectation was for me to say, I'm going to have this youth program, number one, and then that youth program, and then that youth program, and then that youth program. So I decided that I was going to have a real conversation with this young man, and I said, listen, there is no economy that has ever been built, no great economy that has ever been built with some of these youth programs. There's no great economy that has ever been built that way. Actually, Every demographic in Zimbabwe needs an economy that works for everyone. That's what's needed in this country. Because a lot of populist governments, what they do, they will try to attract the youth vote by saying, okay, these are the youth programs that I'm going to create. And you and I know that every program that is actually focused on just one section of the economy, of the demographics of a country, rather most of these programs, there's money taken from there to support this. And a lot of times you can have that youth program, but the economy itself is not working. And as long as that happens, that youth program will be short-lived. So we need an economy that works for everyone. Let's go back and see during the time when there were a lot of opportunities for young people, when there were apprenticeships, when you came out of high school and you could go to Zisco and you can become a fitter and turner or whatever. And there were apprenticeship opportunities for young people. That whole demographic group that we're talking about benefited from these apprenticeships. Why were there apprenticeships? Apprenticeships were not a youth program. Apprenticeships were a product of a working economy. When you have a working economy, you have opportunities for everyone. You have jobs for everyone. You have training programs for everyone because you have a working economy. And when you look at the economy of Zimbabwe, if we actually want our youth to be absorbed into these things, it will have to be a healthy economy across the board. We had apprenticeships in Bulawayo. We had apprenticeships at the Hwange Colliery. We had apprenticeships at Zesa in Mnyati. We had apprenticeships in Shurugwi. We had apprenticeships in Mutare. We had apprenticeships everywhere because we had an economy that was functioning well across the board. So when we talk, for instance, about the importance of resuscitating provincial economies, that's what we're talking about. You know, that's the youth program that you need. You need an economy in Mashingo that is fully functioning. You need an economy in Matabeleland North and Matabeleland South that is fully functioning. You need an economy. Then those opportunities for young people are created. So this whole idea that, the youth are going to be taken in and they're going to vote for someone simply because they produce a list is tragic. And I can assure you, if the list is what people use for governance, your problems are not going to be solved. And it doesn't matter if the nature of those promises. People can come up with new terms like we're going to create technology hubs. I happen to know that there have been technology hubs that have started in this country, and most of those technology hubs were supported by NGOs and so on, and some of them have closed now because even a technology hubs needs a working economy. You need a fully functioning economy for a lot of the things that people promise. And unless we get the fundamentals right, unless we actually make sure that we have the right leadership from top to bottom, unless we make sure that we have a real commitment to the rule of law, unless we make sure that we have truly competent leaders at every level. And these are not leaders who are just simply selected through the political parties, which, as we can see, at the end of it, produce a faulty product. But if we can actually open up the participation in the public space and in the private space to competent Zimbabweans, then we're not going to have a working economy. We have to have leaders who know what they're doing at every level, including at the level of council. So this is a message that I really needed to say very strongly to young people. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled by lists. Listen, open your ears, open your eyes, and really at election time, figure out which political party, which leader is really telling you the truth in the first place, because we need that. It is really the truth which shall set us free. Which leader is really telling you the truth, and which leader is really committed to really creating a functioning economy in every part of this country, because that is the youth program that you need. That is really the youth program that you need. If you do that and you put the right people into office, you're also going to, you're going to be rewarded. While we are at that, let's also talk about something that is not always talked about in terms of creating the new economy. People will promise you that we'll get into power and we'll create so many jobs. And the way that we're going to do it is by attracting foreign companies to come in here and invest. And they're going, as a result, we're going to have 2 million jobs. Well, you know what? Let me say this. We are coming into this as a country at a time when there is so much that has changed in terms of how things are done. The technology, even in the extractive industries, has really, really changed. And in order for things to be cost effective, what you're finding is that more and more companies and organizations are actually utilizing technology. So I was watching the other day a program which showed us a mine in Western Australia, in Perth, a mine run by Rio Tinto, where most of the things that they do at that mine have actually been automated, including the huge trucks that they use to carry ore, once it has been extracted. And then the rigs themselves that they use for the actual mining operation have also been automated. Why is Rio Tinto doing this? It's more cost effective for them, and they can actually mine 24 hours without violating labor laws. They can do more with less people. And even though this mine claimed that they've maintained the employment levels at a certain level, you and I know, that with more technology, you're going to create less jobs and have higher productivity. So what does that mean for us as Zimbabweans? We really must think, we must say to ourselves, how are we going to really fulfill the promises that we make to the Zimbabwean people? Because just opening ourselves up for people to come in, for companies to come in, is not necessarily going to create the magnitude of jobs that we think it will. That's a reality of the new economy. That's a reality of how things are done now. So if that's the case, how are we going to solve our 90% unemployment? So in many ways, what that means is that we need very serious leadership. And we need a very, very serious conversation with ourselves so that we can figure this out. How are we going, for instance, to make sure that all the 90% of Zimbabweans who are unemployed have a job? Well, that might actually require for us to figure out, actually, how do we empower the informal sector and formalize it so that the jobs that Zimbabweans create for themselves become the jobs that they have. How do we do that? And how do we make sure that there is a serious partnership between an indigenous economy, which is informal right now, and foreign capital? Those are not easy answers. Those are questions that must be answered by people who are very thoughtful, people who really consider some of these issues very, very seriously. And those are the kinds of leaders that we need going forward. And young people, you must insist on those kinds of leaders being elected. You must elect those kinds of leaders. Now, let me quickly move on to another point so that we can have ample time to interact with some of your questions. We must have dreamers, obviously. We must have people with vision. Some of those things, you have heard me say that what I would like to see happening in our country is us creating an economy and a nation which is great not just by the standards of Africa, but by the standards of the world. And what I would like us to be careful of, even in saying that, is that sometimes we think that we can pick some of the things that are very obvious in some of these economies, things that are good, and we can say, we're going to build that, we're going to build that. In fact, what we need to understand is that most of the things that we must build, obviously, and that our people deserve, even in terms of commuter services and all of that, most of those things happen because of the functioning economy. They're not the ones that drive the economy. They happen because there's a functioning economy, and the tempo of that economy then requires to be serviced by certain types of infrastructure. So if you have to move goods and services and people quickly because you have a high tempo economy, then you need a commuter system that actually services that. And apart from that, you have to be able to fund those things. So the starting point with everything is an economy that works for everybody. That's the big dream that we should have. We should have this big dream of an economy that is just on fire in Bulawayo, in Mutare, in everywhere, in the non-metropolitan provinces, where the economies that are working, because most of the things that we want to do, which we must, and which we must have actually, are things that are produced by that economy. And they're produced by that economy, again, to service the tempo of that economy. If you don't have a functioning economy and you do some of these infrastructure programs, that's where you end up with highways and bridges that go nowhere, or with white elephant projects that are started and, big projects. And you know what? International partners are willing to give you money for that, because you're always going to be on the hook to pay that debt off anyway, even if it doesn't work for you. So you start with focusing on your economy, and you make sure your economy works. And when you do that, you create a certain tempo, and that tempo, that speed of your economy needs to be serviced by certain infrastructure. And that infrastructure then, becomes the modern infrastructure that we see in so many places. So I wouldn't like for people to be dismissive of the dreams that others have, to have certain infrastructure and so on. But in my opinion, I truly believe that the starting point is making sure that you have an economy that works for everyone. And when you have an economy that works for everyone, then there is a certain demand for certain infrastructure. And you respond to that demand so that you can keep the economy running. One more thing that I'll mention before I start looking at your questions and responding to them. And this is something that I feel very, very passionate about. I've made a slight mention of it before, but I truly believe it's something that we should talk about. Diaspora vote. I've said this. I was in the UK recently, and I said this to some of our members. I said, I'm really discouraged and disappointed that some people in the diaspora have seemingly given up on their fight to have a vote. And that is something that they have to fight for. We all have to fight for it, but they have to fight for it even more. It's your right as Zimbabweans. And 2018 is way too critical. And there are two things that I believe that the diaspora needs to do. The diaspora needs to fight for their vote and make sure that they get that right to vote. And the diaspora also needs to make sure, because you have been exposed, you have lived in countries where things work. The reason why you're in those countries is because things work. There's opportunities for you. There's job opportunities for you. There's opportunities sometimes for your children. But, contrary to what many may believe, I know that there are many people in the diaspora who yearn to be back home. And even though they may look like they're happy, it is really tough being in a country which is other than your own, and where the values are not your own, and being far away from relatives. And we know what has happened to the fabric of the family here in Zimbabwe. It is time, I truly believe, that the diaspora makes this fight such an important fight. And some people may say it's too late. It's never too late for you to fight for your right. Some people may say it's too difficult. It must never be too difficult for you to fight for a fundamental right. It must never be. It must be something that you press for this election, something that you press for future elections. It must be something, it's a fight that you must win. And I think that is really, really critical. As I begin to address your questions, I really want to encourage everyone who is in the diaspora to remember that this is your fundamental right. It's a constitutional right. It's something that you should fight for and really make sure that you win, whether for this election or for future elections. It is your right. Ladies and gentlemen, again, it's very, very critical for us as Zimbabweans not to be used to fight the battles of other people. What is our fight as a Zimbabwean? It's the fight for us to have our full freedom so that we can build a great, great nation. In the next few weeks, I'm going to be talking about something that is also very, very close to my heart and something that I truly, truly believe should focus our fight. And that is the fight against poverty in our country. And it's something that if we all focus our attention and our efforts on that fight, you know what, we'll create a country which works for everybody. And so I really welcome you to this fight. So I'm going to begin to address some of your questions, and we're not obviously going to be able to address every question. I want to begin with a comment which somebody actually posted. Yes, the best but not known. Me implying that we are the best but we're not known. I'm glad that you know us though. And sometimes, again, I really would like for us as Zimbabweans to really understand that the election is not done yet. This is why it's called a campaign. We campaign, we make our ideas known, and we continue doing that. We don't start handicapping the election before it is done. That is really very unfair on our people. And you have a responsibility, my brother who made that statement, to make us known, to make these ideas known. And by the way, we don't take anything for granted, and this is something that I really want to emphasize today. We do not take anything for granted. We must fight for every single vote everywhere. We must go to every place and actually, fight for every vote. Someone said, talking is not action. Ed has just started rolling the ball. Yeah, talking is not action. That's why we're not just talking. We actually just got back from a wonderful, wonderful meeting in Mutare this morning. Unfortunately, social media doesn't always have an eye on the things that we are doing on the ground. But I can assure you that we're going everywhere, and we're very, very encouraged by the responses that we're getting from Zimbabweans. And I would also like to say, by the way, even talking on social media when it comes to citizens who respond to some of the things that we say is also not action. It's important for you to support whoever you want to support and make sure that they actually have a chance to win, particularly if they have the best ideas. And if it's not us, that's what democracy is all about. Support the people that you feel have the great ideas. And unfortunately, there's a lot of us who are on social media, and we feel that our responsibility is just to say, talking is not action. I would challenge you and ask, what have you done for the political party that you support? What have you done for the candidate that you feel has the best ideas? Have you given towards their campaign? Have you gone out there and told your relatives about that candidate? Have you actually engaged with the people that you support to give them advice? Have you? And if you haven't done so, you're just talking as well. So it's very, very important for us all as Zimbabweans to fully participate, not just on social media, in the political process. Someone asked and said, how can 15 billion disappear just like that and there is no follow-up? This thing gives me sleepless nights. Well, 15 billion will disappear again if we do not have the right leaders who are committed to accountability, if we do not have the right checks and balances. 15 billion and even more is going to continue to disappear. Now, this has been the story of many African countries since the beginning of the decolonization process about 50 years ago. So new leaders have come to replace the ones that have plundered the future of our children. And they've done exactly the same thing. Because in the euphoria of bringing about change, there are certain things that we don't insist on. We don't insist on checks and balances. we don't insist on making sure that we have the right leaders who are committed to accountability, and leaders who, if something goes wrong under their watch, they will actually resign, because as far as they're concerned, they should be producing results on behalf of the Zimbabwean people. So if we don't do that, in fact, one of the things that you're going to find is that in some countries, you will have someone winning the presidency, but not necessarily having a parliamentary majority. And as a result, what they have to do is to persuade parliament. They have to actually go there and persuade people that theirs are the right programs. And in some ways, you actually wish we could actually have such a system where, one can win the presidency, and even if they do not have a parliamentary majority, actually that becomes a check on their power. They don't feel like they have untrammeled powers. They can just do what they want. And that's the problem in Africa. So yeah, 15 billion will disappear if we do not have the right leaders, and if we don't have a system that even penalizes them. You remember what happened when Minister Obed Mpofu appeared before the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee and he refused to answer questions. Well, what were the consequences for that? None. We haven't seen any so far. And if you and I were to be honest, we heard about the fight against corruption, that this government was going to really fight against corruption and all of that. And I don't think that you and I have seen any people actually being brought to trial for corruption. At first there was these attacks on people who were thought to be aligned with Grace Mugabe. And so those were politically motivated as well. And that doesn't mean they didn't steal. But still, the moment that you taint the justice process by political motivation, there is a lot we lose as a result. So 15 billion will continue to disappear and more if we actually don't have the right leaders leading this country. And if we as Zimbabweans do not participate in the process of choosing the right leaders. Another question is, I'm appalled by the healthcare system. Which are lower than grounded here. Our healthcare system has been more than grounded. If leaders are not embarrassed for seeking healthcare abroad, I don't know what else does. No morals and ethics to treat others with dignity. Again, wonderful question. Everything boils down to the kind of leaders that you actually vote into office. If you vote into office leaders who are not committed to the principle that what must happen to the least of our people really determines whether they continue in leadership, then we're going to continue having this. So a leader must actually feel that the very same kind of health care that they deserve is the same kind of health care that a citizen of our country deserves. You have to have those kinds of leaders. They have to be committed to that. The other thing that you have to be committed to is also making sure that you have leaders who know what to do. Because, sometimes I also feel that we have leaders who are, put in certain positions who have had no exposure, who have had no experience, building even any institution. And it's high time in this country we tapped into the experience of Zimbabweans who work in the National Health Service in the UK, in the National Health Services in other first world countries, and make sure that the conditions of service are attractive for them, to come home and be part of the solution. I was on a flight the other day with a lady who had actually been a matron of a fully functioning modern hospital system. And she comes back home and nobody taps her knowledge. She doesn't have the opportunity to actually do anything to serve her people with her knowledge. And that's one of the things that has really been terrible for our country. So until we have the right leaders, until we have leaders, yes, like you point out, who are actually embarrassed that they have to fly out to get medical treatment whilst other people suffer and die, this is going to continue to happen. Someone asked and said, but how do we get there, Dr. Manyika? I'm not sure exactly what they were referring to, but I guess how do we get to a fully functioning economy? It all starts with leadership. let me go back to what I said earlier. The types of people that end up running our key institutions in this country, whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's the educational system, whether it's the transportation services, whether it's the energy services and so on. What you and I need to understand is that all these people come in through the political pipeline. The people who are appointed even by the politicians are people who are card-carrying members of ZANU-PF and so on. That has nothing necessarily to do with competency. So you can't build a fully functioning and healthy economy when you allow only people that come through a political pipeline that, frankly, you and I know is heavily damaged to be the ones who assume office in this country. You have heard me say that actually, if you elect a president in 2018, they must be given the right to even bring some people into the executive who are not necessarily members of parliament. It's something that is really critical. We have to be able to bring in people who, on the basis of their knowledge, into the executive to make some of the critical decisions for our country. Then we have to have parliamentarians, obviously, who have been elected by people to help hold those people accountable. If we don't have that in our country, it is going to be very difficult for us to get there. Someone asked and said, would you not have been better off fighting from within or trying to change from within? Very good ideas, but doesn't running on your own newly formed party dilute the votes? So here is my answer to that. This is a campaign, and the Zimbabwean people need to be given the best ideas and let the Zimbabwean people actually determine the outcome of this election in a democratic way. In the event that there are those who share the same values and those who actually have the same values and same ideas, and they find each other. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with actually coming together. But we don't join for the sake of joining. We join because we share the same values and ideas, and we believe that joining together actually gives us the best chance to accomplish an unprecedented mobilization of Zimbabweans everywhere to participate in building their country and determining their direction. So there's nothing that has been precluded. We are here. We are actually in the process, and we will let that process play out. But the most important people is not shortchanging the Zimbabwean people. We want to be able, at this point, to give our ideas out to Zimbabweans and make sure that they have the best ideas to consider as we go towards the election. So, yeah, I want to thank you for all the questions. And there's still a few more. Let's see. Say you don't win as an opposition, what role will you play? Because there is no democracy without an opposition in our governance. So here's the most important thing for us as a country. We want to get to a stage in the politics of our country where everyone feels they can actually bring their ideas forward and that those ideas are considered. And, you know, you can play that role, whether you're in government or as an opposition party. It's important for you to be heard. And the Zimbabwean people need to be able to hear even the opposition in parliament presenting their best ideas so that they can put pressure on the executive to consider those ideas. One of the biggest problems with majority rule, the way at least it has actually been, practiced in African countries, is that if you go into an election and you win with a majority, then it means that only your ideas should be implemented. And there's something faulty about that. And a lot of times it means that whatever people who are considered minorities in terms of numbers and population, whatever they say, their ideas are also in a minority. But you realize just how self-defeating that is. The fact that there are people groups who are a minority in numbers does not mean that their ideas don't make sense, you know. And unfortunately, with our kind of political system, what you're going to have when you have a majority rule and a parliamentary majority is that people are actually going to be very, very arrogant in parliament and say, you know what, we won the election, so it means our ideas are the best ones. That's not how it works. In building a country, you go into parliament even with your majority and you listen to everyone. What you have won is the right to listen to everyone and translate what people are saying into public policy. What you haven't won is the right to say, I'm not going to listen to everybody. So it's that's something that is very, very dangerous when it comes to majority rule in our country and in a lot of African countries, because people say, you know, we have won, therefore we don't listen to anybody. But you don't build a great country that way. You and I know that you can have a parliamentary majority, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the people, the competent people, to run the country in that parliamentary majority. So somehow we actually have to love our country more than we love our parliamentary majorities and be able to bring everybody in to determining the direction of our country. Someone asked and said, can you talk about the health system? What is BZA's approach? You know, every part of our economy and every sector of our nation is ultimately impacted by two things. One, the quality of leaders that you have, and two, the nature of our economy. Those things are critical for us to get right. It doesn't matter whether it's the transportation system, whether it's the health system. These two things are very, very critical. You have to have the right leaders and a functioning economy to actually build the kind of health system that you want. And it's impossible. Let me go back to something that I addressed earlier when it comes to infrastructure. And I said, sometimes we say, we want to build this commuter service. And I said earlier, the only way that you actually build some of these modern commuter services is if you actually have a functioning economy, because you have to resource that. You have to have the resources for it. And if you don't have the resources for it, you can't. So the idea that we can have a good health service without the right leaders and without a healthy economy, is just a dream. We have to have the right leaders and a functioning economy to be able to do this. Look, our people deserve. I was having a conversation with someone and we're talking about universal health care for Zimbabweans. And, there are programs that are out there that are done by other countries, like the National Health Service in UK. And sometimes you hear about it almost being bankrupt and so on. And because it is really affected by the performance of the British economy and so on. And it's very easy for us to be dismissive of the National Health Service and say, hey, you know what, it doesn't work because of that. We have to find a way in our country to make sure that everybody has primary health care. And we have to make sure that we're responsible stewards of our economy so that we can fund it. At Independence, we talked about, free education for everybody. And we actually started implementing it. And at some point, we found out that we couldn't afford it. So these two things should work hand in hand. We must have these high goals for every sector of our economy, but make sure that we can actually build an economy that ensures that we can support that. So as far as the health system, if we actually don't have the right leaders and we don't have the right economy, it's always going to be challenging for us to have the right kind of health system. It's going to be challenging for us to make sure that we have basic health care for every Zimbabwean and the specialized health care that we need for our economy. Another question was, the deals being struck right now by AED are contractual. How will you manage a country with contracts you did not negotiate? Which deals are problematic to you? Yes, so, I talked about this before. This is, and I say that I'm very uncomfortable with a lot of the deals that are being announced right now. And Zimbabweans then celebrate and they say, oh yeah, truly we are open for business. We must always ask ourselves, what does that mean? What does being open for business mean? Who is really negotiating those deals? What competencies do they have to negotiate those deals? Sometimes government can be so desperate. Like right now, in this period, this government is so desperate to be seen by the electorate to have done something, to have brought in money. And so we've had the announcements. so many billions of dollars of deals have been negotiated and so on. It's the same kind of headlines that we've read in the Herald for the past 37 years. There's nothing new about that. The thing that should worry us is what kind of deals are being negotiated and what are we going to settle the next government and future generations with. So, to answer your question, how do you deal with this? These are things that you'll have to deal with negotiation, and it's not going to be easy. And this is the reason why you need the kind of leadership that will tell you the truth and that will warn you even right now. You know what? Don't be so enthusiastic for these guys who are there, who are negotiating deals which are not transparent. We don't know what they are agreeing to. We have a long history of this country of mortgaging our resources to people who are our friends at that time. And then when we realize that this is going to cause us political problems, we then make these statements that, they are the ones who are externalizing and so on, but there are no consequences for it, even. So, yeah, it will have to be dealt with, through negotiation. And this is why you need a serious government. You need people who are going to go into that negotiation with anyone and not blink and really stand their ground and really negotiate to the advantage of the Zimbabwean people. You need competent people. You don't just need people who, are exciting. You need people who know what they're talking about. You need people who are very familiar with international law. You need people who can exploit even some of the loopholes in international law to get some out of some of these contracts because they were not negotiated in good faith. If you don't have that, then you're always going to be saddled with these bad deals, and it's not going to be good for our people. As far as elections are concerned, what is your plan to win them? Here's how we plan to win them. We plan to win them by contesting for every vote, going everywhere, and doing the grunt work that is necessary. And sometimes we, as the Build Zimbabwe Alliance, we don't get much credit for that because that's not open on social media. When you go into a village and you're talking to people one-on-one, which is really what is needed. Every election is won, through retail politics, on the ground, pedestrian politics. And I can assure you that our team is very, very committed to doing that. And certainly between now and the election, we're going to ratchet things up. And somebody asked and said, what's your plans to make sure that it will be free and fair election? That is a really important question. Some of you will remember that a few weeks ago, we went to Zimba. We had gotten police clearance to have a rally in Zimba. And after we got our police clearance to have a rally in Zimba, we went there. And lo and behold, the current Minister of Justice, Ziyambi, had written to the district council and ordered the district council not to allow any political party other than ZANU-PF to do anything in the province because they had booked every venue and every minute and every hour until August, which you and I know is a lie. And we did that. We produced that information. In fact, it wasn't just us who produced that information. There were independent journalists who wrote about that. And you know what is interesting? There's no outcry from Zimbabweans. There's no, people didn't feel that was a big issue. And unfortunately, let me tell you something. It is a huge issue because we have 150 rural constituencies and only 60 urban ones. And if this is happening in all the rural constituencies or in most of the rural constituencies, then you, not just us, because sometimes people will come and they'll say to the opposite, you have a problem. No, the Zimbabwean people have a problem. Because if this is happening in most of those constituencies, then what it means is that ZANU-PF has a lock on 150 constituencies, and they do that through this kind of intimidation. There was also a story which was carried in one of the newspapers about intimidation of people in Wedza. And there were people there using the name of General Chiwenga and threatening that they would bring Operation Restore Legacy to the community if the candidate who was supposedly associated with General Chiwenga did not win the ZANU-PF primary. And they were terrorizing people in Wedza doing that. Look, we plan to make sure that this is going to be a free and fair election by going everywhere and exposing these things, but we cannot do it by ourselves. It will have to be Zimbabweans who get angry at some of these things, at some of the attempts by anybody really to deny them the opportunity to cast a free and fair vote. At the end of the day, Zimbabweans need to turn up in their numbers for registration. Zimbabweans need to turn up in an unprecedented way during election time to send a message to the authorities here and to the international community that in the event that it is not free and fair, they're not going to accept that result. I will address one more question before we shut this, and this is something that is going to be a regular program for us, and I'm very, very excited to engage with you and to answer your questions. And the last question that I'm going to address today, in fact, there's two more. Doc, can you speak on how you've already demonstrated your commitment to the full participation of young people in the nation building process? Well, you know, one of the things that we have done, and look, we're not the only ones that have that commitment to young people. There are many others who have that commitment. In fact, what I welcome is the ability to actually place in the ring, as it were, our own ideas and so on. And look, may the best candidates, may the best parties win. That's what elections are all about. So in our own case, as some of you know, over the years, I've worked with young people on both sides of, in the United States and here in Zimbabwe. We've done a lot of leadership training programs here in Zimbabwe. We've created what we called problem solvers clubs in high schools. We started a program called Project Textbooks because we saw some of the problems that high schools were having here with supplying children with textbooks. Sometimes you would go into a classroom and there's one science textbook being shared by 25 to even sometimes 40 students. So we did that, mobilized resources for Project Textbook to come from the United States and were given to schools here. We have rehabilitated derelict schools in Zimbabwe, partnered with organizations like World Shelters to do that, so that we make sure that our children are not, getting educated under trees. And these are not, we're not the only ones who have done this, and certainly the problem is so huge that I can't claim that we made a dent, a significant dent, even on that problem. But that's my commitment. The future is our children, and it's very, very important for us to make sure that our children have the facilities to go to school and facilities for good health and stuff like that. So I want to thank you for your participation in this program, and I encourage you to listen to the things that we're putting out there. I'm saying this again, and I mean it. May the best candidate win. May the best party win. May the people who have a demonstrated commitment to building a great nation win. I'm not afraid of competition. I'm not afraid of all the other people who are going out there and putting out their ideas. That is the way that it should be. And I can assure you, there are some who assume that simply because we are civil, we are not going to fight. We are going to fight to make sure that our ideas are heard. We are going to fight to make sure that the people of Zimbabwe are not shortchanged. We are going to fight to make sure that whatever shenanigans people may be planning to deny the Zimbabwean people their right to vote are defeated. I want to thank you for a wonderful time and a wonderful exchange. And as we always do at the Build Zimbabwe Alliance, we put our hand on our hearts. Then this right hand is the hand of our strength. And we say Zimbabwe, Nyika yedu, Naka yedu, Zimbabwe, ilizwe letu, ilifa letu. Zimbabwe, our country, our heritage, because that's really what it is. And we have a commitment to actually make sure that we leave an inheritance to our children's children. Anyway, thank you and good night.